Well, I'm delighted to welcome our next speaker today. He was frontman for one of the most iconic bands of the 80s. He also was asked to join Thin Lizzy, one of the top rock bands of the 70s and 80s, on a US tour. He then went on to write probably one of the most famous songs, top 10 famous songs in the world, Do We Know It's Christmas? And then got involved with Live Aid to boot, which was certainly a day that seemed to change the world. Welcome, Midge, OBE.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm very good, very good. Thank you for your time today.
It's a pleasure.
Initial quick question, Midge. Obviously, with lockdown, what have you been doing? What have you been entertaining yourself?
Well, in here, funnily enough, this is my little box of tricks. I suppose, being a professional musician, I'm in the very envious position that even though the world has closed down outside, nothing really changes. I find myself in here most of the time, whether I'm whether we're in COVID or not, the lockdown or not. I was in Australia and New Zealand touring. I was taking my 1980 tour, which doesn't mean that I was touring in 1980. I had two albums in the big seminal albums in the charts at the time, 1980, and I was celebrating the anniversary of those things. And the tour took me all the way to Australia and New Zealand. When I was in New Zealand, we started hearing about this virus. By the time I'd left New Zealand to get to Australia, New Zealand had closed its borders, so they were way, way, way ahead of the curve. And the whole thing chased us around Australia. Meant by the time we got to Perth, everything had closed down. We didn't manage to do that gig. We didn't do the one on the way back in Dubai that breaks up the journey. And I've just been in my little box since then. I creative to think of things that you connected with an audience. So I've kind of designed this, and I'm sure you'll ask me about it anyway. So I've designed a little platform that enables me to stay connected with people out there.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, one of the things that struck me when I looked through your career, there's two moments. I've heard you in interviews before discuss this, but there was obviously that moment when you're queuing up in Buckingham Palace to collect your OBE, which I believe was from the Queen.
It was from the Queen, yes. Yeah. That's true.
But also that time when you were growing up in Glasgow, I think you described it as a tenement slum, one bedroom with yourself, your brother and sister and your parents, all in one bedroom.
Yeah.
Did you think about that whilst you were queuing up for the OBE? It seems like a fascinating journey that that young boy would never have known, obviously.
I think it's not something that you aimed for. I think there are things that happen to you on the way to what you aspire to be or aspire to want to do. And that leads you often on a little individual path. It's not maybe the path that you sat down as a kid and jotted out for yourself or mentally jotted out for yourself. You do deviate. Things happen. The telephone rings. Someone sends you an email. You bump into somebody, and your course changes. So I suppose at that moment, standing there in Buckingham Palace, waiting to get this honour from the Queen. It probably did flash through my mind that this kid from Cambuslang in the outskirts of Glasgow shouldn't really be there. I suppose there are moments of, have they got the right person? But my life's been peppered with moments like that. I've said many times, if you jotted my life story down and tried to make it into a Hollywood movie, Hollywood wouldn't believe it because it would be so ridiculous. But that's kind of how these things work. So I didn't intend to end up in Buckingham Palace, but I was very grateful that I got there. It was kind of like a grown-up version of, when your teacher at school used to say, pat you in the back and say, "Well done, you," or "That's a nice drawing, son." It was a glorified version of that.
So with the creative process of you writing songs, obviously we've got a lot of young people watching today, and resilience is always important for all of us. How do you deal personally with setbacks when perhaps somebody doesn't agree with you, and if you've written a song or you've got an idea as a producer? How have you dealt with that in the past?
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, if you're lucky enough to be in a situation where you're writing songs with people you respect and admire, you can disagree with them, but still understand their point of view when it comes to a lyric or a line or a melody, or it's the same whether it's writing songs or being part of a band. You know, you have to be able to give and take a little bit. If you're in a band or you're in a situation with another songwriter or a producer that you don't respect and admire, why would you listen to them? You know, it doesn't make sense. So I think you've got to avoid finding yourself in situations where your say, you know, if you really feel it strongly that your say is being ignored, you have to get yourself out of that situation. But you've got to be big enough to understand that what they might be saying, even though it rankles a little bit, that there's maybe a little bit of experience and a bit of, you know, water under the bridge and a bit of, you know, time under the belt and every other cliche you could think of, that they might just have a point. But if you're absolutely against it, you've got to walk away, because you have to believe 100% in what you're doing. And that's a difficult thing for any artist, for any songwriter. I mean, I've written a lot of songs and I still find it difficult to let other people hear them, because if you've written something that's from the heart, it's kind of exposing yourself to the outside world. And especially when I have to write the lyrics for the inside of a CD label or for the internet or whatever, and you think, well, someone's going to sit down and read this. That seems even more exposing, because it's not hidden by the music. It's so out there. So I think you have to have a fairly strong skin, and you have to have the courage of your convictions. If you believe it's right, you are right. Nobody else can tell you any different.
Which is applicable for many walks of life, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's not, as I say, it's not just songwriting and it's not just being in a band. If you absolutely believe that you are 100% right, you've got to follow your heart. Just like my mother said to me, you've got to take the path that you want to take, even though it might seem that you're walking away from something that could be interesting or could be lucrative or feels like it's scratching your itch. Somewhere down the line, if you're not happy with how that's starting to go, believe me, you will not be happy with how it finishes up.
Yeah. So just moving on through your career, and I certainly don't mean to gloss over Ultravox, which was one of the biggest, as I say, bands of the 80s, but I'm mindful of our time today. Talk me through that phone call when Bob Geldof, who was for our younger members of the audience, was lead singer of another huge band called the Boomtown Rats. You suddenly get a phone call from Bob asking you to help him, about which ultimately became Band Aid. So how did that conversation go?
Well, I was doing a television show in Newcastle, in the north of England, and Bob's girlfriend, wife at the time, Paula Yates, a journalist, and she was co-hosting the program with Jules Holland, who I'm sure everyone knows if you watch, Later with Jules. And I was appearing on the show, and I'd known Bob and Paula for years. Bob phoned Paul up about some domestic thing and said, stick him on the phone. And I took the phone, and Bob told me he'd just seen the initial footage the BBC had just shown of the famine in Ethiopia. This is 1984. And a famine that we didn't really know about. It wasn't national news for us. It'd been going on there for a few years. But because it was a communist country, they kind of kept it quiet behind closed doors as much as possible. And Bob said, look, I want to do something about this, but the Boomtown Rats are gone. You know, I'm house sitting, I'm looking after a baby or something, and you're still out there doing the thing. Can we talk about this? So when I got back to London, we met up. And you have to imagine this, because it's really quite pathetic. The two multi-million selling songwriters sitting having lunch, talking about what we could possibly do to raise some money, and the song idea came last. As you well know, 50% of any record that you make, any recording you make, goes to the songwriter. So we couldn't just cover, a Christmas standard. We had to write something and then donate the songwriting royalties to what eventually became the Band Aid Trust, the body of people who are still there today, overseeing the funds and where it gets spent. So, Bob, I was fortunate enough, I just finished building my studio at the bottom of my garden. And Bob is useless in the studio. He doesn't know one end of a keyboard or a desk to the other. So he went off and immediately bumped into a few other, fairly well-known artists at the time. One of the guys from Spandau Ballet and one of the guys from Duran Duran. And they both committed to doing this, to being part of this. So once you have the snowball rolling, it starts to gather momentum. Once you've got the first 2 or 3 artists saying, yeah, I'm up for this, I'm doing it, I've seen the footage, this is disgusting, I want to do this, it starts to take on a whole different shape. So I spent 4 days in my studio playing all the instruments that you hear on the record and arranging the song. And we had 1 day in the studio that you saw, it's on YouTube, you'll find it, it's up there, the footage of the day all the artists turned up at the studio in West London to do all the vocals and record Phil Collins' drums and kick them all out and mix the record within 24 hours. Because in those days, records were bits of plastic on vinyl. And if we didn't get the vinyl and the finished mix to the pressing plants and the vinyl on the machines to start pressing them up, we would have missed Christmas, which is rather unfortunate as it was a Christmas song.
So what was it like? I'm trying to think back to this amazing lineup of stars that you managed to get together. I shudder to think how that would look in today's world. You'd have the Arctic Monkeys and the Foo Fighters, and it would just be the most phenomenal. What was it like handling all those egos? Was everybody tuned in? Was everybody happy just to say, what do you want me to do? When do you want me to do it? Was it, without naming names, of course?
It was that. It was the latter. Everyone turned up not having heard the song, and you have to understand that as well. Nobody had heard a note at all. So they all turned up at the studio on a cold, wet Sunday morning to add their strength and their fan base to this thing. Without having heard the note, because there was no way of playing it to anyone. They heard it in the studio when they arrived. And everyone was on kind of best behaviour, bearing in mind that it's kind of intimidating being in a room full of your peers. These are people who sold more records than I had, and I'm sitting playing them a song that was okay. It wasn't a great song, it was okay. But they stood there waiting their turn to do their part. And they did it brilliantly, absolutely amazingly. Bono was there and Sting was there, and Boy George was massive at the time. Duran, Spandau. It was a massive lineup of people, and they all just did what they were told, did what they were asked. And I was just sitting there in charge of the thing, trying to work out who was going to sing which line of the song, because we hadn't figured out how many artists were going to be there to divide the song up before they arrived. So I was kind of flying by the seat of my pants.
Wow. So when you first sat down with Bob and said, let's write a song, let's get it together, let's get out for Christmas, blah, blah, blah. What were you hoping to raise financially? What was the dream?
Well, the realistic figure based on what an artist would, the percentage an artist would get from a label at the time, which was somewhere between 8 and 14%, depending on how good a deal was. So we thought, well, if we can get a deal for this record at 14%, and we got a Christmas #1, which was imperative, because back then, aunts and uncles and relatives and whatever would buy whatever was #1 at Christmas and give it as a Christmas present. So you could sell twice as many records having a #1 record at Christmas, because the charts froze the week before Christmas right through to January, I think. The charts didn't move, so you could sell a lot of records. We figured that based on the royalty rate that we could get, if we raised £100,000, that was doing really, really well.
And what to date, have you any idea what that single has raised?
No, I couldn't put an accurate figure on it, because again, something really sad. It never struck us that if you make a Christmas record, that it might come out every Christmas afterwards. So every time it comes out and it's played on the radio, the money generated goes directly to the Band Aid Trust. As I said, Bob and I gave the songwriting royalties, forever. So we've never seen a penny from it. It goes straight into the Band Aid Trust. So it changes on a monthly basis, on an annual basis. But the total somewhere between Band Aid and Live Aid is something like $175, $180 million.
So the single's number one, that's all hunky-dory. We then go on to Live Aid, which I'm sure many of our audience will be aware of, which was just the most amazing day, you know, watching it. How did you feel on a very simple level? I know you were obviously involved with, you know, putting it all together, but when they say, and please welcome to the stage, Ultravox, and you have to walk out to a packed Wembley, and am I right in saying it was broadcast to 160 countries?
Yeah, again, I think both Bob and I were on in the first hour.
Yeah.
So that was kind of early for, you know, America and, you know, a lot of the planet. So I'm not sure how many people saw us, which is maybe a godsend. But yeah, the whole thing went out to, it was like 2 billion people. 2 billion people saw this thing, which is quite incredible. At the time, it was the biggest concert the planet had ever hosted. Yeah, very scary walking out. I mean, at the time, because of the technology that Ultravox used, it was very basic technology. It was quite fairly advanced for its time, but very basic when you look back at it. And our sound checks for a regular show used to take 5 hours to do a 2-hour show. 5 hours to make sure that everything worked on stage. And of course, at Live Aid, there was no sound check. You had a line check. So we chose songs that we could perform that used the least equipment, the least stuff that could break down, because nobody wants to, you know, to have a silent mic or a drum machine that goes crazy or a keyboard that doesn't work in front of, you know, millions of people. So walking on stage was scary. The scariest part was just before you walked on stage, which nobody knew about. We were told as you walked on stage, the production manager stood there and said, as you walk on, there'll be a traffic light system either side of the stage, and you walk on and it's green, and it's 16 minutes, because you've only got 18 minutes in total. It's 16 minutes, it'll turn amber, and then you won't see it turn red because the power goes off. Everyone had to adhere to that. Otherwise, artists are just old tarts, aren't we? You get on there and after 15 minutes, you start to enjoy yourself and you want to throw in an extra song. You cannot do that. You can't do that when you've got satellite feeds coming in from all over the world. So it was petrifying walking on there. And the whole thing was gone in a nanosecond.
I've got one more question for you. And thank you so much for your time today. If you had to give one piece of advice to our audience, young people in college looking to either go into work or university, and I appreciate it's a pretty big question, but do you have a piece of advice that you wish you'd perhaps been given?
Yeah, I think you have to have a rhinoceros skin. You have to be able to take the rough and the smooth. Never believe anything that anybody ever writes or says about you, good or bad, because if you believe the good stuff, your head won't fit through the door. If you believe the bad stuff, you'll be crying in your drink for the rest of your life. I think the advice I would give anyone who writes is that you write, and you write as much as you can, because not everything you write will be great, not everything you write will be successful, but by going through the process, it will lead you towards something that will be great. It will lead you towards something that will resonate with someone on the other side of the planet, which I never saw coming, but it happens on a regular basis. So artists who have touched your heart, that you love and respect and admire, one day you will be in that position where someone will feel the exact same way about what you do. So when you're tired writing, write some more. And when you're tired doing that, write even more again.
Midge, thank you very much indeed.
An absolute pleasure.